Good morning, everybody. As you can see, I'm out and about in the English countryside. I'm actually on holiday, but I've decided to make some YouTube videos. So this week we are going to be delving in to all things English. We're going to be looking at, or I should say British. I have said British, to be honest, not just English. So we're going to be looking at the best bands, the worst music artists, the best music artists. We're going to be looking at the history of British music band by band, sort of taking two for every decade. You know, there's going to be a whole bunch of fun, and we're also going to be out and about in the English countryside. So even if you think what I'm saying is just mindless waffle, which it most likely will be, you will still be able to enjoy the English countryside. If you want to know where I am, I'm in Whaley Bridge, which is in Derby, just south of Manchester. And I'm on the side of this great big valley, and I've just walked down into the valley to see what's going on. And it's part of my fitness campaign. I want to get a bit fitter. I've lost a little bit of weight already, mainly from shaving my moustache off. But as we approach here, see, I don't know what's around the corner of any of this. It seems that here we have a graveyard. Oh wow. So just found, this is England for you. Just found her in the middle of nowhere. There's no roads here. I just found that little doorway behind me. I wandered into this. So this is the first one. Should we get on with the business at hand, everybody? So let's get into this first list. This is going to be the 10 greatest British bands. Now, before we get going on this, I have to say that there's loads and loads missing. And when I was coming up with this list, it was just really, really difficult to, omit bands like the Kinks or the Small Faces or the Who or the Jam or even the Clash or Radiohead or the Cure or the Smiths. All very difficult bands to omit from the list. I know there's a ton missing. I have sort of taken this on bands that really changed the climate of music, innovated, but also that, in my opinion, were great bands. And so at number 10, I probably have the most contentious band on this list in terms of a great band, but I am about to argue it for you. So number 10 on my list is the Sex Pistols. Now, the Sex Pistols represent a period of British music that started up around about 1976. It grew up out of the pub rock movement. It contained bands like Dr. Feelgood and Alex Harvey. And so I've got Mojo with me. You'll be glad to know, accompany me. My plan was to walk down to the valley to assess the surroundings and then walk back up and get a video done. So this will be a test of my fitness, and I'm feeling it already. We've got a long way to go. Anyway, Sex Pistols, what can we say? I think they're the poster boys of the punk movement, which is described as a reaction against all the pomp and circumstance of the progressive rock era. I think in reality it took certain aspects of that music and walked away from other aspects of that music. It's interesting to look at what it didn't do rather than what it did do in terms of the English aesthetic. I think these bands marked a cultural change as much as it marked a musical change. I think the great musical change wasn't just going away from the 20-minute songs and the bombast, but it was also taking out the blues, maybe taking out a bit of the soul. The punk bands returned to a visceral rock and roll aesthetic, but without the sort of gutsiness that the Stooges or the New York Dolls or NC5 had. There's no bluesy vocalizations, there's none of that Americanness. It's a very British thing, isn't it? And I think, although the Clash and the Stranglers and the Damned, and then later on, you know, Susie the Banshees, the other later punk bands, Undertones, all that lot. Musically, they all did their own thing, and it was very great. But what was more important is that they had hit records. This was a return to the single. It was a return to the pop charts. In that way, punk acted in exactly the same way as disco. The Sex Pistols, therefore, are being the poster boys of this movement, really, I think, represent the values, the important stuff that made this music change the generation that came in after. And remember, I am that generation. The Sex Pistols seemed to speak directly about Britain at that time. The American bands never did this. They had the veneer of college educated people. Sex Pistols weren't that. So in many ways, here in Britain, where class is so important, they represented a shift in who was making rock and roll, away from the posh boys and back to the working classes. That didn't mean the music was unintelligent or less educated. John Lydon, their lead singer, basically took a good, tight, working class glam band that would have been quite happy doing covers of the Glitter Band or Sweet, and by adding some sort of awareness and love of English culture, especially English literary culture, he stood at the front of that band looking like a Shakespearean character, professing like a British Zoroaster at the beginning of a new dawn. And perhaps that character was Richard III. Growing up as he had in the 50s and the 1960s, he would have been aware of Laurence Olivier's portrayal of that. And I also always thought of that combined with, I don't know, the Aqualung character by Jethro Tull, a band that Lydon has then gone on to profess to love, and of course vocally a mass taken from the music and especially the vocal stylings of Peter Hamill. But the songs were so catchy, and before you knew it, you had these hooky tunes all over the charts in my country, sung by a band that was fulfilling the proper anarchistic ideas that came through. The Levellers, you know, the Toll Puddle Martyrs, the blokes that went and smashed up all the factory stuff, what were they called, the Luddites, the New Model Army, and all of these British movements would provide names for post-punk bands. If they didn't, if there is no Luddites, then grab it now while you can. About punk-inspired bands, this was a live music revolution. You didn't need a revolving stage and 15 guys to pick up your Leslie speaker and your Moog synth. These bands could rock up to any venue and put on a gig, and it was entertaining on both levels, musically and theatrically. I went to see the Sex Pistols in 2008. Obviously then they were playing a quite large venue, but the truth was they were an incredible band. There was no two ways of saying this. Morning.
Morning.
So that's why I'm going to put them in. They represent something, and I think it's a good place to start with a band that was so adept at mixing English aesthetic ideas with rock and roll. Now my dog's just met another dog, as you can see, so I have to now take
I'm back home. Well, not back home, I'm back to my cottage or whatever I want to call it that I have rented for the week. And I realised that me trying to walk uphill and talk at the same time is not going to happen. I've had a coffee. I've had some lovely, they were very nice actually. I've had some savoury mini eggs from the co-op and finished off my chicken wrap from yesterday. And what's bizarre is I'm looking out from here to that church we just walked to. We're at the top of the valley, so if I just turn that around there, I don't know whether you can see that with this camera, but right in the middle you can see a little church, and that's the walk we've just done. So this video has an aspect of what is known as Gestalt. Gestalt being that thing where you are sort of aware of your surroundings, aware of what is happening around you. And with this list, it's often good with a YouTube list, try and create some sense of Gestalt. Now, of course, the feeling we have here is that we are actually ascending up a list to greatness. And I think that's unfair. I think the ranking here is quite arbitrary. All these bands are so incredible that it's really hard to put one band against the next on this list. Now, there was a couple of bands that didn't make the list when I first did it, and then they popped into my head, and I had to take off some serious bands, which this had happened a couple of times, but when I'd done it, I felt like, I've lost the gestaltness of having Radiohead there, because Radiohead aren't going to be on the list representing that sort of mid-90s post-grunge indie bands. I'm not going to have a great 80s band, especially late 80s. I mean, where's Dire Straits, for example? And where's all those indie bands? You know, or so-called indie bands. And I thought, you see, you've lost your gestalt, because the truth is, there are truly great bands are really emerging at the late 60s, early 70s. And the band we have at number 9 is a band I feel that ushers that era in. It's the band that comes along and really moves from sort of your pop beat bands, which the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and the Kinks and all those bands were, to something completely different. This band were only going for about 2 or 3 years, and in that period they sold 30 million records, and really, I think, created rock and roll. That band, of course, is Cream. Now, I think one of the reasons why Cream go under the radar now when we start thinking of classic bands is perhaps because of the Jimi Hendrix experience, another group that does something very similar, although in the sort of immediate shadow of Cream emerging mid-1966, and then the Jimi Hendrix Experience bringing their first single out late 1966. And I believe whatever Hendrix had in his mind, his sort of weird concoction of psychedelic blues, rhythm and blues and soul, was changed dramatically by what Cream did, and I think he admitted this at the time. Cream are really important because they are not a bunch of pretty boys growing up in a town together like the Beatles and forming together and forming a band and getting signed. All these musicians are already seasoned session musicians on the London jazz scene, playing in the Graham Bond group, playing with John Mayall. Eric Clapton had basically created lead guitar playing Clapton basically invented rock guitar soloing on the Beano album with John Mayall. It's a stroke of genius for these three to come together. Of course, Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce in the Graham Bond band had the incredible John McLaughlin as their lead guitarist, and there are recordings out there of a precursor to Cream with Duffy Power on vocals, performing a sort of proto-rock sound which is completely different. It actually sounds like a sort of crooning version of the Mahavishnu Orchestra. They're well worth checking out, these recordings. There's a Duffy Power album that came out in the early 70s that collects those recordings together, and I think it's called something like Innovations or something. It's so ahead of its time. But no, the genius was to unleash a blues guitarist into a post-Coltrane, post-Ornette Coleman, electric-based rock rhythm section. The blues guys, before Cream, had not done long guitar solos. The long guitar solos are coming from free jazz, from modal jazz, and to some extent from psychedelia as well. If you think about it, in '66 we've also got Pink Floyd doing their long form jams. So Cream emerged in that. And the thing that's interesting now I think about Cream is that when you look at the albums, and many of their classic albums are live and studio. This is very important because live they were one thing, they were like this improvising beast of raw power, right? In the studio they were a lot more progressive. And if we look at their first single, Wrapping Paper, which is a very English sort of novelty song almost, if you were to take the great long improvisations of Cream and these strange English little studies, you know, early rock studies, and were to edit them together in a certain way, you would have absolutely progressive rock. So they are so important. Of course, bands that don't form, you know, in the town with that chemistry do not last long. The following year we get the Mahavishnu Orchestra, which also doesn't make this list obviously because it's not a British band, it's an international band. But bands like that where you have true sort of musical genius coming together, they don't last long. Right, let's move on now to number 8. At number 8 I've got The Police. Now I have a funny feeling that the fact that I've missed off bands like the Kinks and the Jam and, you know, the Smiths, Joy Division, The Cure, My Bloody Valentine, that contingent are going to be upset that The Police have made the list. Why are they there for? I'll tell you why they're here. Because between 1979 and 1983, this short-lived band, which are basically the late 70s, early 80s answer to Cream, really coming out of the identical sort of musical world that Cream had. 3 virtuoso musicians that were going to come in and redefine the sound of rock music, which is what they do. But of course the Police then go on to become the most successful band in the world at that time, selling absolutely millions and millions of records, with a songwriter at the heart of this band that is one of the greatest songwriters this country's ever produced. And a little bit like Phil Collins, Sting is able to write songs that go beyond critical acclaim or cool, snidey rock types, you know, wanted to, you know, tell you that Passengers by Iggy Pop is the greatest song ever written, which is a great song, but it's not Every Breath You Take, right? So the ability to write such iconic, culture-changing songs, the ability to sell millions of records, but also the virtuosity of that band, Sting's vocals over the top in a range which is unfathomable, but most importantly, the sound of every single instrument being redefined. There's Sting playing sort of reggae bass line, but with a plectrum, and in a sort of coordinational way with his voice, which is quite astounding. And then of course we have Stuart Copeland and Andy Summers that redefined the sound of their instruments at that time. And in doing that, redefine the sound of the power trio, and they change what we consider to be power in a power trio. If you go and check out their, you know, one of their last gigs, which was the where's that? Is it Shea Stadium? That huge concert that was filmed, and you watch the band and you see the energy that's in this band. They surpass any punk band for energy, because not only could they jump around and play at 1,000,000 miles an hour, but also they had the virtuosity to back it up. I think there's an argument that if you were to put every single parameter down that you judge a band by, and then measure it from across the whole base, the Police actually come back as the greatest band ever made. So why is it that people don't feel that they are deserving of this list? Well, I think the idea that Cream came together, you know, great musicians coming together, they never got accusations of being manufactured, because of course there was so much manufactured pop, and the Cream were definitely not pop. But I think there's an idea that there's a sort of manufacturedness. Now the manufacturedness that the Police have is their shift from whatever they were into before to taking on the mantle of punk. But they weren't really a punk band, were they? Now the truth is that all the bands coming out in 1979, Joy Division, The Cure, all those bands that we're talking about, and maybe there should be one of those bands, maybe I should have put The Cure here, right? But I don't think The Cure did what the Police did. So that's why the Police are here. But the Police are as much a part of that legacy of the redefining of rock music and the bringing together of progressive rock elements with punk elements, and in this case reggae elements and ska elements and African music and all sorts of different things that happen to be in here. Jazz is another one that really subfuses the Police's oeuvre. And they really come in and pull all that together. And I think what's most important is their dragging of the ideas and aesthetics that emerged in the progressive rock realm, in the classic rock realm, back to making pop songs. And I can't think of a band, Duran Duran did that to some extent. Japan did it. All those bands were interested in writing pop songs. But did any of them do it as well as the Police? I don't know. For me, one of the greatest bands of all time, and totally deserving to be on this list.
I thought I'd come out here for this one. We are trying to put into this video a sort of undercurrent, or I say undercurrent, a huge dose of the English aesthetic here. And of course, to really get back out here has to be put aside for one of the classic progressive rock bands. Now I have to be honest, King Crimson really hovered around being so important in the creation of the progressive rock genre, but I feel that the band that defined that genre more than any other band is Yes. Yes also sell millions of records, and they are also uncompromising in their progressiveness. There's another band on this list when we get there which we could say is a progressive rock band. I would say they're a progressive rock band, but they don't quite go to those outlandish territories that Yes do. Formed in 1968, they're pulling together the sound of the Everly Brothers, the Byrds, the Beatles, and John Anderson's key here, because John Anderson is a rocker and he's had experience already in the London music scene. He's a rocker, but he's a rocker with his own sound. And I think that John Anderson, just that voice, right, is so unlike any other voice. He's a little guy. His voice is slight but high and beautiful. But the thing is, yes, rock. And so many progressive rock bands in 69, 70 that are pulling these ideas together, including King Crimson, including Van der Graaf Generator, including Genesis, a lot of them, for me, are fanning around trying to create some sort of English rock and roll, and they forget about the rock. Bill Bruford and Chris Squire are one of the most muscular rhythm sections and completely balance each other, because Bill Bruford's got that high tinny cutting sound, and then Chris Squire's got this great big meaty almost lead guitar on the bass sound. What they really required was some virtuosity in the keyboard and guitar department, which they eventually get with Steve Howe and Rick Wakeman. And I think the first fully fledged Yes album is the Yes album, and with that running all the way up, I think, to 90125, we have a run of truly great albums, with maybe Tomato being the only stumble on that way. But for me, I could sit with those Yes albums for the rest of time and not really have to go to any of the other prog bands. I think if you are a progger, you're either a Genesis guy or a Yes guy. I found that when I was in IQ, most of them were Genesis guys. Me and John Jowett were Yes guys, and I think it was because we were the rhythm section. I've spoken so much about this band, what can I say? All I can say here is I'm stood outside and it's pretty nippy, the wind's up, you might be just getting loads of wind noise on my little microphone and nothing else, but that's the trouble. That's what you deal with, that's what you're going to get, right? You're going to have to listen through that, but my God, look at it. So shall we move on? Let's get back inside. I just had this thought that if you are watching this video, at this point, if I was watching it, I would go, all right, Andy, okay, yeah, you're in different places every time you do it, and then you move about and all that, but you just stop it now, we've had enough of that.
you know, and that's how I feel. So I'm going to stay here for the rest of them. It was all right up to a point, wasn't it? You know, but the thing is, here I am on holiday, and I've taken a week off from YouTubing a couple of weeks ago now. The first week I took off, I actually didn't take any time off. I just did so much YouTubing that I had 2 weeks worth of videos, and then programmed in the break, and then I've got this second week of videos, and these videos are being shown whilst I film this video. So those all went up, and then I left to come here. Now, if I hadn't felt like YouTubing, I would have taken another week off. But what's interesting for me is coming here and just having the change, because I haven't had a holiday for 11 years, you see. And so I often think that to renew yourself creativity, you have to stop and get a different viewpoint. And I suppose that's gone into this view, this concept of this video. I say this view because I'm staring out into this incredible bit of countryside. It's very unlike where I live. It's a lot of really big rolling hills, and the light is different today. It was really sunny yesterday, but today there's a sort of steeliness about the sky, and the landscape is quite dark up against that sky. It's northern in a way. It's very northern, and as you can see, the elements are out. Even though in the middle of the summer those English elements are out, they bite at you. And when you get to a place like this, you realise that the ancestors that bought this country grew up in a very bitter place, you know, sort of an island stashed away at the top of Europe. And there's a certain earthiness, a certain toughness. When I arrived in this village yesterday, and I drove, and it was blazingly hot, but the northern types that were walking up and down still had their hats and coats on. They don't shift. You could tell that they wear those, whatever. I'm up near Manchester. We're up north now. I wish the next band on the list were a northern band, but in terms of northern bands, the 6 that we've got to go, I would say most of them are southern bands. Most of them are London-based bands. That's a completely different vibe to where we are at the moment. This band, number 6, probably rival the Kinks as one of the great London bands, and that, of course, is The Who. Now, The Who is a band that I don't talk about much on this channel. They're a band that, when I have spoken to them, I sort of knocked a lot of the 70s stuff, you know. I'm not a huge fan of Who's Next, their classic album. I'm not a fan of all the sort of Tommies and Quadrophenias. And I think once Moon goes, they really, well, those albums aren't that bad, to be honest, but there is a thrashing around, to be honest. They lose, with losing Keith Moon, they lose a certain thing that makes them so great. And I have to come on here and tell you what that is. And I think Keith Moon's the key, because Keith Moon is such an unconventional drummer. Now, back in the early 60s, when kids were picking up drumsticks and playing the drums, those drummers that emerged at that time were unconventional. Why? Because how did they learn? How do you learn the drums in 1958, 59? You either go to a jazz drum teacher and you learn to play traditional grip, but a lot of the guys that were playing on the session scenes were those types of drummers. You know, your Brian Bennett's and your Clem Catinis, they were schooled players, but Keith Moon was not that, was he? He was something else. But in his own way, he creates his own virtuosity, and then he has to find a band that can operate within his parameters. Now, Keith Moon is not a neat player. There's neat players and there's ebullient players. I'm an ebullient player. Moon's an ebullient player. Ginger Baker's an ebullient player. Mitch Mitchell's an ebullient player. Whereas people like Steve Gadd or Gavin Harrison, or a lot of the modern progressive rock drummers, and virtually all drummers now, are all nailed and precise. How do you tie yourself to something that's untethered? Which is what The Who have to do with their sound. And what it is that the bass part is being held together by Pete Townsend. So Pete Townsend's role of writing riffs has gone. He can't write riffs. He has to punctuate the sound with these great big clash chords. That sound is so influential on rock music. Anybody who does a da-da-bang, you know, and it's a fanfare. Now, as you know, I'm huge, you know, Rush fan. And yeah, when you put on that first Rush album, my God, does it sound like Led Zeppelin. But in their basic sound, they are the sound of The Who. And Alex Lifeson is pulling that sort of great slashing markers in the music, which in their case, rather than having Keith Moon, you know, stuff going on in the background, Neil Peart seems to take that and then order it. So it is far more ordered. And of course, Neil Peart is not an ebullient player. He is one of those nailed players, probably a little bit too nailed at times. But I'm trying to explain to you how important the sound of The Who is and how no band can really copy it. John Entwistle is coming in at a time when the electric bass has only really been around for the most 10 years and played on commercial recordings. We're probably talking 5 years. He makes the most of modern electric bass playing more than any other bass player, and he makes the most of active pickups. And he becomes the lead guitarist in that band, weaving along in much the same way as Clapton was going to do later on. Of course, they start off with that mod period, and you hear that Moon is far more precise there. And later on, when they get into that Baba O'Reilly period, and they're playing to, we call them sequence, but you know, synthesizer loops and stuff like that, the sort of nod to Steve Reich that Pete Townsend brings in. You know, they had to tape the headphones to Mooney's head, but he played to a click and he did it very well. So I think they knew what they were doing. For me, the Who's sound is most remarkable when they are doing songs like I Can See for Miles or My Generation. This is really laying the groundworks for heavy metal, really, if you listen to it. We have to give the idea that Pete Townsend invents the rock opera to Pete, and in doing that he runs alongside, a little bit like Queen do as well, what progressive rock is doing. But the Who, they stand on their own, and I feel that when punk came back in and the British bands wanted to move to something that was more visceral, it was the Who that they had in mind. And the mod aspect of the Who, the sort of Union Jacks and the little jackets and the sort of a certain coolness, which was all mixed together, that not only influenced the punks, but I do believe it influenced Robert Plant as well, who sort of takes Roger Daltrey's idea of the front man and runs with it, shall we say. So that's who I've got at number 6, is the Who. Number 5, I've got that band that I mentioned earlier that is he's a prog band, but not a fully fledged prog band like Jethro Tull or Genesis or yes, it's of course Pink Floyd. Where the hell do you put them? This is a giant of a band, really. Again, a product of London, posh boys, very middle class. It's takes the ideas of the Beatles, but it moves it on into a sort of intelligent, sort of secure, almost like bank manager place. Now, when you listen to those early albums after Sid goes, right, is it bank manager rock there? No. These are young guys who have friends who are bank managers that can support them. I'm always shocked how long Pink Floyd go, making albums that really have no accessibility to them and are directionless. But in their sort of experimental electronic meanderings, they do lay the groundwork for what is krautrock rock. They happen to be, I think, in the early days, once Sid's gone, because Sid is a record company dream. He writes incredibly catchy pop songs. He's completely in line with the zeitgeist at the time, and he looks fantastic. And then he's gone. So Pink Floyd have to try and negotiate who they are. And this toxic dichotomy between Roger Waters and Dave Gilmour in the early days works very well together. And they slowly negotiate a way of songwriting, which I think reaches its peak with Meddle, Pink Floyd at Pompeii, and then Dark Side of the Moon. Dark Side of the Moon is the greatest album ever made, period. Right? I spent a week trying to work out what the greatest album ever made was. It's Dark Side of the Moon. At that point, their status, their sort of English classness starts to take over. And although they feel that they're being very political and sophisticated, that sophistication, and there's this really Roger Waters that does this. Dave Gilmour will just, left to his own devices, slide towards a sort of bank manager rock. But Roger Waters appears to kick against it, you know. But what we get is a man moaning about, you know, how he's a multimillionaire and a sense of attention in the world of rock music, which is what you get with The Wall. And this is why I always have my doubts about Pink Floyd. But for me, those early albums, badly conceived as they are, and they are, Ummagumma, More, Saucer Full of Secrets, and there's great tracks on all of them, but they don't know where they're going, right? But they're allowed to go there, and when they get there, they create albums of such incredible brilliance that they are totally deserving of being on this list. That's who I have at number 5. At number 4, I've got Led Zeppelin. I've had to sit back for this one. I haven't got a proper camera stand. That's one thing I should have brought. Then I could have just put something up there like that and sat comfortably. Although it's not a great view, is it? I like this one because it's got that. I like that view there because it's got that abstract painting in the background. When I walked into this place, you know, when I first walked in, I had to check it out. And me being me, I walked up the stairs because this is the top room. Walked straight upstairs, and when I saw that painting, I went, "Oh, this is amazing!" What a like bloody artsy fartsy snob I am. This is what you're dealing with me. You have to understand, artsy fartsy snob. Anyway, talking of artsy fartsy snobs, surely this is what Jimmy Page was, because at number 4 I've got Led Zeppelin. How many times have I spoken about this band? Plus, I spent 3 years of my life, and 3 years of my life as my job being the drummer for Robert Plant. And so in my own way, I step into the side shadows of this huge story, which is the story of Led Zeppelin. Right? And it doesn't go away. It doesn't go away. I had to fight, really, after I left the band with Robert, for myself to try and work out who the hell I was. Had I just done the most important thing in my life? That's what it felt like. Why? Because Robert Plant and Led Zeppelin, they're like the gods of rock. Right, they come out number 4 on this list. Who could be bigger than this, you might be thinking. And when I originally did this list, Led Zeppelin were number 2. But of course I thought, we need to have a counterintuitive aspect. We need to have a rethink. And I put them down here. And why? Well, I think, and I'm going to be a little bit critical. This is my favourite band of all time. You've got to understand, I love Led Zeppelin. I think all the albums are absolutely incredible. They're masterpieces. I've never been a fan of In Through the Outdoor, but if that's a bad album, my God, how good are the other ones? Because In Through the Outdoor is just so rich and full of incredible songwriting. It's looking forward, even though that future is not there for them, but they don't know it. They are traversing their way into the 1980s. And I think they would have done it. The proof of the pudding is Robert Plant did do it, didn't he? He was able to move forward. Would he have been able to move forward with Jimmy Page in the background, you know, slowly descending into the hell of heroin addiction? You know, Robert had already had his, you know, he'd seen the black tentacles of chaos earlier in 1977 when his his son Karak died and having that car crash. And I think he got his act together. I think he straightened up. I think that saved him. And he was able then to strike off on his own, because you have to understand with Led Zeppelin that there's a big divide in that band. Led Zeppelin is Jimmy Page's band. That's the key to understanding them. Jimmy Page is this session guy who's done so much, you know, starting in the industry probably as early as about 1963, 64, and not just playing guitar on a whole host of records, but also learning how the production worked. And he had an idea for production. He had an idea for the sound of a band, and his idea is Led Zeppelin. He pulls in his old mate John Paul Jones. John Paul Jones is an incredible session musician, multi-instrumentalist, but most importantly, arranger. Now, arrangement in the late 60s is not the same as the sort of thing that Billy Strayhorn would do for Duke Ellington. The arrangement is about using these multiplicity of new instruments and new sounds and effects to create something really coming out of what the Beatles had done and what Brian Wilson had done, and most importantly what Frank Zappa had done. And it has to be said, John Paul Jones, although a mercurial character in the Led Zeppelin story, always in the background in a way, is always there to step in. He allows Jimmy Page to have his vision, but he can also step in and do a no quarter, or step in and do a Kashmir. These two are seasoned, and they're a little bit older than Robert Plant and John Bonham. These two guys are they're from where I come from, and I know it. You know, Robert Plant had grown up in Redditch and then moved over to my neck of the woods, and he lives there to this day now. John Bonham was born in Redditch, just down the road from where I live. I know what these guys are like. I know who they are. This is not Birmingham people. It's not Brummies. This is a sort of West Midlands thing which takes in the Black Country. And the Black Country is its own little world, which is the part of England that surrounds Dudley. It's started out as a sort of mining, and then there was like heavy industry, a lot of metalworks, and it got famous because when Queen Victoria would get on her train and you know, come up through the country, when she got to the Black Country, she would deliberately put the blinds down so she could say that she hadn't seen the poverty that exists in the country at that time. The Black Country types, they're an incredible group of people. Sometimes called yam yams because of the fact that they will say, instead of saying you are, they go yam, yam daft you am. They would say something like that, which means you're silly you are. They wouldn't say that when they added, they would say yam saft you am. And this way of speaking mirrors Old English, right? And that, stuck on the edge of the Welsh borders, the awareness that, you know, just down the road is Offers Dyke. You know, when I was a kid, we used to have our holidays out in Rayarda, where the dams are. And Robert spent his, you know, being quite a middle class chap, although a Black Country guy, born and bred out in West Brom, he still had his holidays out in Wales, over in Machynlleth, you know, having his family holidays out in Broniar. Why do I speak about all this? Because I think the thing that makes Led Zeppelin so important is they're not the bloody Who, they're not Pink Floyd, they're not just a product of that London scene, they're not just a bunch of poshies, there's something else. And what Bonham and Robert Plant do is they bring in a naivety. It's not some working class ethic, it's not that. It's a Black Country ethic, and it's a connection with the land and the soil. And Robert, once he has that connection with Jimmy Page, he brings Jimmy out, takes him down to Broniar. They feel it. It's something that's really wound in. You know, the Black Country is a dark, industrial place. You know, I live quite near to a place called Stourport, and Stourport is often called by some people Dudley-on-Sea, because the Black Countryites will come down there, because there's a bit of a river there and a flood ground. It's where they have their holidays. And then, you know, in the summer when I was a kid, you'd go down to Stourport and watch the Stourport people having fights with the Dudley people. But there's a connection to something very I don't even want to say English. It exists in the hinterlands of Wales, between England and Wales, and it's suffused with a sort of anarchistic spirit, which is probably best embodied in Owen Glendower. I found it interesting that there's a video on YouTube where Robert goes to meet Brian Johnson. Now, Brian Johnson's a Geordie. I know he plays for AC/DC, but he's a Geordie, and they're connected in that way. And he's from Newcastle, and they decide to meet in the hinterlands of Wales. And they're sat at some bridge, a little bit like the bridge that we saw at the beginning of my video. And Robert comes walking over the hill dressed as a Welsh king. Of course, Brian Johnson loves it. There is something in here that make Led Zeppelin what they are. It's a connection to an old English way of being. Of course, they're deserving to be on this list. They're at number 4 on my list. Shall we move on to number 3? I have changed position. I do apologise. I never stick to my word, do I? Now, I'm sat at the kitchen table now. I thought I'd just get the camera straight in front of me and finish this off. At number 3, we've got the Rolling Stones. I don't come across as a big fan of the Rolling Stones, do I? It's like... and really, there's many people who will mention the Rolling Stones in the same breath as the Beatles, which of course, where are they lurking on this list? How naughty for me not to put the Beatles at number 1, and how naughty for me to not put the Rolling Stones at number 2. And you can see I have been a bit naughty because I put them at number 3. Why? Because I think the trouble with the Rolling Stones is they've been going for so bloody long. When did they form? 1960, 61, 62. I think it's around about 62 they formed. So they've been going for like 65 years, if not more, 66 years. It's like nearly 70 years of this band who have all never split up. How many bloody crap albums are there that the Rolling Stones have made? How many crap songs? How long have they been crap for? Now, they're not crap. If you went and bought the Rolling Stones' latest album, and it's got Paul McCartney on it, hasn't it? He's there playing bass on what Mick Jagger described as quite a punk-like track. This is the top and bottom of it. The Rolling Stones are the quintessential rock band. Okay? They're the quintessential rock band. They start playing rock when they're nippers, which is English for young, and they're still in their 80s with half of them dead. Well, not half of them. Charlie Watts is dead. Bill Wyman's nearly 90 years old and he's in retirement. Counting his lucky stars that he never got done for, what he might have got done for if it could have been proven. Keith Richards, supposedly the oldest man alive. He ain't even as old as my mum. He's 3 years younger than my mum. So why has he got the reputation of being so old? Because the Rolling Stones have been around for so long. But the truth is after the emergence of the Beatles, right? Now the Beatles are a working class rock band, right? Who would win in a fight between the Beatles and the Rolling Stones? It's the Beatles. Right, all of them, even George Harrison. George Harrison was one of the nasty ones. They would be flicking the V's, going peace and love, while they just piled into the Rolling Stones, outnumbered as they are. But they would beat up the Rolling Stones, who were a bunch of posh boys. Mick Jagger might escape by doing some very quick sort of, thin-hipped moves. You can't catch me, you can't catch me. Come on, Ringo, try and punch me, you won't be able to touch me. And Keith Richards, would he be even aware that he was in a fight? Who knows? Now, I'm being facetious here because I don't like talking about the Rolling Stones, so shall I just say what I think about them? They're the quintessential rock band. When they emerge, there's a whole ton of albums where they're doing like blues covers, and they're like a bad representation of the blues rock that is emerging at that time. They are like the kids that are sort of following around the John Mayalls and the Alexis Corners and the Graham Bonds. You know, I always remember a quote from John McLaughlin, who was there when they first formed and was playing those venues with them. And someone asked them about, you know, what he thought about the Rolling Stones. And he said, well, they were out of tune then and they're out of tune now. That's what he had to say. But, and this is the key, I'm going to tell you a story which is quite interesting. My friend and mentor, Kevin Gammond, who again is not very well at the moment, I just texted him a couple of days before I left for this holiday and he's not well at all. He's in bed, unable to walk, and this is a terrible thing for me. Kevin was there. He was playing a guitar for Jimmy Cliff, who at that time in the early 60s had been taken on as a sort of, you know, Jamaican answer to the beat groups that were emerging. So he was playing with all of these people. In my studio, and I can't point to it here because I'm not there, but in the background is Pete Townsend's amp, which ended up in Kev's hands at some point. And he told me, and if you go and look at old photos of Kevin, you can see he resembles Brian Jones in a way. And he said he was once doing a gig with them and Mick came up and said, Brian, we've got to go out and play, come on, get your act together. And Kev had to turn around and say, this isn't Brian, it's me, it's Kev. He turned up in London with a beautiful Gretsch guitar. And the thing about this Gretsch guitar was, it could take being overdriven. It had those sort of meaty pickups that you need, that you can turn up and overdrive the amp. And he ended up selling that Gretsch guitar to Keith Richards. Once Keith Richards had that guitar, he then went home and wrote the riff to Satisfaction. Now, there's a lot of riffage going on just a few months before that track. You know, the Kinks, You Really Got Me, but it's all power chord riffing. It's basically taking that blues sort of guitar style that you hear from Muddy Waters, or especially a John Lee Hooker, and just amping it up. But that riff, it's coming from soul, really. But that heavy electric guitar riff, 65, right? Yeah, we've also got My Generation, The Who coming out, but I think that's where the riff starts. My friend and mentor, Kevin Gammond, played a huge part in the development of the rock riff. And from that point on, I think the Rolling Stones are just making sublime records. Absolutely incredible. And they're skirting with all the things that are going on, and whatever the Beatles are doing, they're doing the inverse of that. And, you know, the Satanic Majesties album, all this stuff is absolutely incredible. And Jumping Jack Flash, I love these tunes, and they, for me, move up to that point where they do that Gimme Shelter, which is them sort of going closer and closer to a sort of American style of rock. And when they bring in the sound of the church and put it into such a profane setting with Gimme Shelter, it's profound. Gimme Shelter is one of the greatest tunes ever made. Then they keep going. For some people, they get even better. Exile on Main Street is really an incredible, at that time, modern rock take on Americana. They nail it. And this is a British band. They nail it by going there. You know, U2 tried to do this, didn't they, with that Rattle and Hum album? They didn't pull it off. But for me, at that point, they bland out. But that period from 65 through to early 70s, there's some sublime records. Who can push the Rolling Stones off to number 2? It's Black Sabbath. Black Sabbath, when I was a kid, were a bit of a joke band, weren't they? You know, all that talk of Satan and the devils, Ozzy Osbourne, a cartoon character that was going to go on to have his own sort of TV show. My God, you know, singing songs about Iron Mans and fairies wearing boots. And I've lampooned them here on this channel a million times. But what Black Sabbath envisage is heavy metal. And what they do and bring together launched 1,000 bands. Now you could say, where's Iron Maiden on this list? Iron Maiden was on this list. That was the band I took off to put Cream on. You know, but Judas Priest, UFO, a whole host of bands coming after Black Sabbath, taking their idea and just honing it, and it still exists today. When Ozzy Osbourne realised that the end was nigh, And because he was a decent fellow and he knew it was the right thing to do, he decided to pull together these three mates to do one last show. Bloody hell. Was that a moment in rock history? A few weeks later, he was dead. And I felt like I was in the presence of a great British character like a Winston Churchill, or even some Viking king like Kirk Douglas. You know, and instead of having his fight at the top of that castle, you know, for Morgana, you know, and getting stabbed by Tony Curtis and then stuck on that Viking ship, what we had was that Black Sabbath gig and then his funeral. What a bloke. Sabbath were the real deal. They were proper rock and roll. You know why? Because there was no front to them. That thing that I spoke about Led Zeppelin, Led Zeppelin had half got it. But they didn't have it like the Sabbath, who are from Birmingham. There's black country in there as well, believe me. But they really represent something that I'm so close to, and I've realised doing this channel, I'm a part of it as well. My character Drummy Dave, which I hate to tell you was actually me dressed up. Don't tell anybody, but it is. Bloody hell, he represents this thing that I love, and it's heavy and it's comedic. What can I say about Black Sabbath? I have done full videos on them, but of course they're not at number one, they're at number two. They're at number two because they invented heavy metal, and in terms of rock and roll, heavy metal is the greatest genre created in the history of rock and roll. So who's at number one? Well, of course, it's Ozzy's heroes. It's the Beatles. Well, we're near the end of this holiday YouTubing. Never done holiday YouTubing before. Been interesting. See if I get better at it as the week goes on. Yesterday we had the drive down. Kids in the back. Bags all over the place. Too many bags for the car. Me doing 80 miles an hour down the motorway. Kids shouting their head off. Everyone wants to have a wee. Go to the toilet. Dogs in there as well. You know, he was good, old Mojo was, but it was a long drive for him. He's never had a drive like that. First time he'd been on holiday for 11 years. How do you keep everybody happy in the car? Well, of course, I have a CD player in my car, which I choose to have. That's what I like, to be able to pick an album and put it in my car, and when I drive around, that's the album I'm listening to. I don't want to skip on to something else, I get a bit fed up. I want to focus my attention on that album. But this is a different situation, isn't it? Because I've got my wife in the car, I've got my two kids in the car, I'm in the car. What do you put on that will keep everybody happy? Well, I'll tell you what it is, and you probably think I'm going to say, oh, it's a Beatles album. No, it's not. It's the original Musicarium by Stevie Wonder. That has always been a long drive favourite for my family, right? But as I sit here, and I didn't plan this, okay? I'm sat here at the moment on the let's just put this over here. I'm sat here at the moment at the kitchen table. Everything here has been plunked here when we came in. A lot of stuff's come from the car. So I've got Mojo's lead here. I've got my bag here. We've got, you know, excrement dog bags. I've got all my YouTubing stuff here in the bag, just in case I need to do stuff, all the little connections and stuff like that. But plugged on the table is one of two albums that got us here. And it's this one. I didn't put it here, it just happens to be here. Beatles, the Red Album, which covers 1962 to 1966, right? This is a best of, okay? But this is a classic album. Why? Well, because the Beatles made too many brilliant songs. Let's forget all the fact of who they are and what they represent and what they did and all the things that I normally talk about here. Let's talk about the songs. There's never been a band like this. This is a 2 CD set, right? This was originally a double album, 4 discs. I've also got the blue one in the car as well. Now this one here is the second one that I've acquired. My first one got lost, and when I complained about that, I said, oh, I haven't got the red one anymore, I lost it. This was sent to me by a viewer. I have no idea who that was now, but if they're around, put it in the comments, because you saved our holiday. Because I've now got them back. You know, before I had this horrible disc of MP3s of Beatles. It wasn't the same. You need this one here. Incredible. The booklet inside here, look at this. Look, this is what albums are all about, you know. And there's the blue album there. I'm not going to talk about the Beatles on here. Here they are, number one. What do you expect from me? I've got to try and get to some sort of truth. I've got to try and get to some truth about this band that I've spoken about so many times before. Yes, of course, in the history of rock and roll, there's going to be these seminal bands at the beginning of it, the Rolling Stones. Like we said, we've gone through them all, Pink Floyd, the Cream, and all this stuff, we've gone through them all, right? But the Beatles, it seems like they have to be there, but they don't, all right? What the hell came together that they wrote songs like this? Now, this is all the early stuff, and of course, us sophisticated rock guys, if we do love the Beatles, and I hope you do, because if you don't, there's something wrong with you. But if you do love them, it's all the later stuff, not things like Love Me Do, Please Please Me, From Me to You, She Loves You. But as soon as this album was on, all the generations that were sat in my car, you know, all of us were together singing along to these songs. And what was interesting, the songs were catching us out. She loves you, and you know it can't be bad. And my kids are going, yeah, oh no, it's not there, is it? The arrangements go right back to these early tracks, are incredible. You know, the way they'll move a melody from a guitar, use it as a middle section. It's incredible what's going on these early records. Right, let's be honest, right? We can say all the reasons why the Beatles are amazing, but the real reason why they're amazing is because they wrote incredible songs. Now, what is going on here? I think it's a working class naivety combined with the burgeoning of a technical process for making music which is going to change music completely, and they're riding that wave. But what never gets spoken about is the naivety in which they find themselves writing songs which never happened usually, right? So why is EMI filling up their records with their songs? And eventually, you know, it goes from, yes, there's cover versions on the early records, but very quickly everything's written by John Lennon or Paul McCartney, who are working together as teams, sometimes writing separately. And even with that, they also have a genius songwriter in reserve, in George Harrison. They are songwriting geniuses. And I could go on about so many different aspects about the Beatles, and I have. But how do you explain the songwriting genius? It's this. There's a certain tradition in my country. It's called music hall. And music hall influenced a whole bunch of films that emerged in the 1940s. George Formby films, Will Hay films, Itman. It goes into the Goons. There is a certain assimilation, actually, of American jazz, blues into British music, which becomes quintessentially British. The Beatles have as much George Formby in them as they have Little Richard. Now, Little Richard, right, when he's saying, you know, tutti frutti on a rooty, he's singing a song about something, but it's probably best not to question what it is. That immediacy of rock and roll is combined with a storytelling, comedic thing that we get from George Formby. And in the 1960s, with all the trippiness, this then aligns itself with a certain sort of Alice in Wonderland surreality. And when I was listening to it and Yellow Submarine came on, I thought, this is proper British music, you know, this is... How did John Lennon tolerate it? John Lennon tolerated it because it was so trippy. And in that tension between two songwriters that didn't know what they're doing. They are suddenly going, what can we do to make our songwriting amazing? They're just sticking chords randomly. There's no following of harmony here, right? They're doing this usual C, F and G chords, the F and G chords, you know. And but they're throwing in other stuff, anything that'll go in, but they're also throwing in different sounds, nicking stuff from modern classical music, from jazz, whatever they could get their hands on to make it interesting. And they're not doing it because it's a callous idea of how to sell records. They're doing it because, I want to say, because of the joy of doing it. But even that doesn't explain really why they were so good at this. The only thing I can say, and this is what we get, is perhaps genius sometimes does emerge and find its way in a new sort of music. And these people exist. Louis Armstrong is the guy that does it in the 1920s for jazz. And for rock music, it's actually the Beatles. Because although, you know, Jagger and Richards wrote great songs and Pete Townsend wrote great songs, there were so many great songs in the 1960s, I think there's something unique about these three genius songwriters. And I can't actually put it into words because genius can't be put into words, or can it? I've tried to do it on a video a few days ago, so you can see what's on my mind. But there's something special about this band. And so the fact that I sit at the end of this video, sit down in this new place I've never been before, with a few things strewn across the table that were just dropped in, essential items when you're on holiday. You know, you take what you need with you. The dog's got to be walked. You know, I've got to have a bag to put my stuff in. You know, this is all the essential stuff we brought with us. And what did we bring with us that's essential? The Beatles. They're essential. Thanks for watching this video. I'll see you on the next one.